All right, so welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something I think everyone can relate to, which is those little awkward moments where everyday English kind of trips you up.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So, we've got a snippet from an English learning podcast that we're using as our source material, and they tackle a scenario we've all faced, right? Like forgetting someone's name. You're at a conference, you're deep in conversation, you've exchanged business cards maybe, and then later, poof, their name is gone.
Yeah. It's like your brain decides to play hide and seek with the most crucial information at the worst possible moment.
Exactly. And this podcast, jumps right into a dialogue, like simulating this exact situation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so we meet Nick, and he runs into Anna after a fascinating conference chat about foreign investment. The problem is he can't, for the life of him, remember her name, but really wants to continue their discussion.
Okay, so how does he navigate that? I mean, this is so useful because we've all been there, right?
Right.
Like, how do you get out of that gracefully?
Right. Well, and that's what's so clever about this approach is that it puts you right in the hot seat. You're not just passively learning vocabulary, you're experiencing the situation alongside the characters, which I think makes the language stick better.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like learning by stealth.
Yeah, exactly. So then the podcast breaks down key phrases from the dialogue in a section they call language takeaways, which I really like.
Okay.
We got some real gems in here, like in a bit of a hurry, contact details, and of course, the classic slipped my mind.
Yeah.
I think it's so funny how these seemingly simple phrases can just cause so much anxiety for language learners.
Yeah, because I think they're often idiomatic, meaning you can't understand them literally.
Right.
Like slipped my mind. It's not as if your name physically slides off someone's brain,
Right.
but that visual, that image makes the phrase memorable.
It's a great way to connect a visual to the meaning, which can be really helpful for language acquisition.
Absolutely.
So, they highlight these phrases and then they provide multiple real-world examples of how they're used naturally. So, can you drive faster? I'm in a bit of a hurry.
Right, right.
Or, I'm so sorry I forgot to respond to your email. It just slipped my mind. I've definitely used that one.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
And I think that's where this podcast's focus on nuanced usage really shines because they don't just give you a definition. They show you how these phrases can be adapted to different contexts.
It's like they're giving you the tools to build your own sentences rather than just handing you prefabricated ones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's empowering, right?
It is, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so then they move into a section called Putting It Together, where they dig into phrases like around here and terrible with.
Okay.
And they demonstrate how even these simple phrases can have slightly different meanings depending on the situation.
Well, and I think that's a critical point, right, for achieving fluency, because it's not enough to just know the dictionary definition of a word or a phrase.
Yeah.
You have to understand how its meaning can kind of shift subtly based on the context.
Right, totally, totally. And so they illustrate this with examples like, is there a bank around here?
Yeah.
Or, and this is, I have to admit, this is a personal favorite, I'm terrible with numbers.
Oh, same.
Right. I mean, who hasn't felt that way at some point?
Absolutely. Yeah, all the time.
But what I find interesting is how they use these really relatable examples to make the lessons less intimidating and more engaging. It's almost like they're saying, hey, we all struggle with these things. It's part of the learning process.
It's very reassuring, right?
Yeah, it's like, okay, it's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, then we get to the fluency builder section.
Okay.
And they break down casual greetings. So, how's it going?
Okay.
And here's where they make a really interesting point, I think, about avoiding overly formal language.
Yeah, that's a common trap for language learners, right?
Totally.
They focus so much on grammar rules and, correctness
Yeah.
that they just end up sounding stiff and really unnatural.
Right.
Yeah.
And this podcast does a great job of emphasizing the importance of sounding natural and confident because, let's face it, nobody wants to sound like a textbook
Yeah.
in a casual conversation.
Especially not when you're just trying to get to know someone.
Exactly. And so to kind of, add to that, a human touch, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
they sprinkle in personal anecdotes throughout the episode.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so in one of them, the host hilariously recounts forgetting a family member's name at a reunion.
Oh, no.
And it's so funny. But, it kind of brings us back to the universality of these experiences.
Oh, yeah.
We all make these mistakes.
Regardless of your language proficiency.
Totally.
Yeah.
And sometimes those mistakes can lead to some pretty funny stories.
Exactly. And I love that they bring that in because it It makes you feel less alone in the struggle.
Right, totally. And it reminds us that, everyone, even experienced language learners and teachers, has those moments.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So they also offer some, practical advice for dealing with these situations. For instance, they suggest asking for someone's business card or requesting their email address as like a subtle way to get their name without directly admitting your memory lapse.
That's such a clever tactic
Right.
because it underscores how this podcast goes beyond simply teaching the language, right? Like they're equipping you with strategies to navigate real-world social interactions.
Yeah, it's like having a communication coach in your pocket. So far, we've seen how this podcast, really cleverly uses like realistic dialogue, relatable examples, and personal stories to kind of teach everyday English.
And they've managed to distill these complex linguistic concepts into these really easily digestible and engaging lessons. Like, it's both insightful and entertaining, which is, the winning combination
Yeah, for
for
sure.
any language learner.
It's fascinating how this seemingly simple scenario of just forgetting someone's name can open up a whole conversation about like cultural differences in communication.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like in some cultures, like directly asking for someone's name again might be considered rude, but in others it's totally fine.
Oh, absolutely. And the podcast actually touches on this a little bit. Like they mentioned that, while these strategies they suggest, might work in a lot of Western cultures,
Hmm.
they could actually backfire in others.
Yeah.
It's really important. This is a crucial part of language learning,
Yeah.
understanding that cultural context.
Totally. It's a good reminder that language isn't just words and grammar, right? It's all tied up in social customs and etiquette. Like I remember once traveling in Japan and I totally blank on the name of a business contact that I had just met.
Oh, no.
And I was mortified. But I quickly realized that bowing and exchanging business cards was a much smoother way to kind of reintroduce myself in that situation.
It's so true. Sometimes those nonverbal cues and culturally appropriate gestures are just as important, if not more,
Yeah.
than the words themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It speaks to the need for language learners to be adaptable and observant,
Yeah.
picking up on those subtle social signals. It's like they say, when in Rome.
Do as the Romans do.
Right, exactly. But it's not always easy to know, like, what the Roman way is, especially when you're learning a new language and culture.
For sure.
What impressed me about this podcast is how they managed to, like, pack so much practical advice into, like, a relatively short episode.
Yeah, I agree. They've really distilled like the essence of real-world communication.
Yeah.
And they do it in such a light, engaging way that it makes learning like less of a chore and more like an exploration.
And that's so important, right? Because when you're enjoying the process, you're more likely to stick with it
Oh, yeah, for sure.
and actually use what you're learning.
Absolutely.
So if we kind of zoom out a little bit, what are some of the bigger takeaways from this whole conversation that we can apply to our own language learning?
I think the biggest one is that, fluency isn't about grammatical perfection.
Right.
It's about being able to confidently navigate, real life situations, understand the nuances of the language, like we were saying with those idioms, being comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And also, being sensitive to those cultural differences.
Right. And maybe just as important is the idea that it's okay to make mistakes. Like we've all been there, forgetting names, stumbling over words, feeling that wave of embarrassment. But it's all part of the process.
Oh, absolutely. And I think instead of letting those moments, derail us, we can choose to see them as like opportunities for growth. Each fumble, each awkward pause is just a chance to learn and kind of refine our skills.
Yeah, I love that. It's about turning those like cringe-worthy moments into stepping stones, on our language journey. Now, something else that struck me about this podcast was the emphasis on personal stories and how they make the material, more relatable and I think more memorable.
I think it's such a smart strategy. And
Yeah.
it really creates a sense of camaraderie with the listener, like they're saying, we've been there too, and you can get through it.
Totally. And it reminds us that everyone, even experienced language learners and teachers, has those moments of awkwardness. They also encourage listeners to share their own experiences and tips.
Oh, that's great.
And I think that creates like a fantastic sense of community and shared learning.
It's such a powerful reminder that language learning isn't this like solitary pursuit. It's a collaborative journey where we can learn and grow together.
Absolutely.
So have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Maybe forgetting a name, struggling to express yourself,
Right.
What strategies did you use to kind of, navigate that moment?
Yeah.
We'd love to hear your stories.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your stories and any tips that you might have for our fellow language enthusiasts. Like, this whole deep dive has been so eye-opening,
It has.
highlighting how language is so much more than just like words and grammar.
It really is. It's a reflection of culture, a tool for connection, and kind of a window into the human experience.
Yeah,
And sometimes those like seemingly awkward moments can lead to the most unexpected and meaningful connections.
I completely agree. Now, before we wrap up this episode, I'm curious. If you were in Nick's shoes, right? Like
hmm
facing this awkward moment of forgetting Anna's name, what would you have done?
Hmm. Well, I mean, we've talked about some tips from the podcast, right? Like asking for a business card.
Yeah.
But is there another approach that might work? Like sometimes those things don't feel natural.
Right.
Um, I think maybe leaning into the humor of the situation could work.
Okay.
Like, something like, "Oh, I'm so terrible with names. Would you mind reminding me yours again?"
Oh, I love that. Yeah, because it like acknowledges the awkwardness, but in a way that's kind of like lighthearted and self-deprecating.
Exactly. And then maybe they'll confess to being terrible with names too. It's all
Yeah.
about making that connection.
Right. Right. Totally. And that brings us back to, I think, the most important takeaway from this whole deep dive. Language learning isn't about like striving for some like unattainable level of perfection. It's about connection and communication and being okay with those fumbles along the way.
Yeah, yeah, it's about being human,
Right.
you know? We all make mistakes. We all have those moments where we feel like we're drowning in a sea of unfamiliar words and grammar rules. But I think if we shift our perspective and see those moments as opportunities for growth and connection, the whole journey becomes a lot less daunting and a lot more enjoyable.
Yeah.
So embrace the challenges, celebrate the small victories. Don't be afraid to laugh at yourself along the way.
That's beautifully said. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into, the wonderful world of everyday English. We hope you've gleaned some valuable insights, maybe even a few laughs. Remember, language learning is a journey, not a destination. Keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep those embarrassing stories coming. We love to hear them.